Hello, welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. Today we're going to continue our journey from beginner to Grandmaster, exploring the whole of chess in a logical fashion, and we're going to do it by looking at a game between Alexandra Kosteniuk and Evgeny Tomashevsky. Alexandra Kosteniuk was the women's world champion and is a Grandmaster. Tomashevsky was Russian champion and is consistently rated over 2700, as high as 2750. So these are two really good players. This was played in the Tal Memorial Blitz. Kosteniuk is white, so as we've discussed, pawn to e4 makes way for the bishop, makes way for the queen, starts to control the centre. e5 does the same for black. White attacks that pawn on e5 and makes way for the king, potentially to castle into safety. Black defends the pawn. And then white's playing the bishop to c4. This is the Italian game. This is a good square for the bishop, attacking that weak point on f7. Black does the same, bishop c5. Then white plays this move c3, which looks a little bit mysterious, but the idea is to play d4 and then take back with the c-pawn. Black has time to attack the pawn on e4. White's playing d4. White takes back, and then the bishop checks on b4. We've seen all this before in the previous two videos. White blocks with the bishop on d2. It's a very natural move. Black takes, white takes back. So that's a nice developing move, but d2 is not the best square for the knight. Black has pawn d5, so making way for the queen's bishop. I'm not sure it's forcing an exchange in the centre, but it's really strongly suggesting an exchange in the centre. I suppose white could play bishop d3, I suppose, but who knows, maybe that blunders the d4 pawn. All 450 examples in my database are taking with the pawn on d5. Should we just look if it really does blunder the what happens here? Okay, you know what, this is actually, as it happens, this is playable, although I would say inferior, because it's not blundering anything. I mean, in fact, just as a matter of interest, knight takes, queen takes. There's the check on b5. Right, this is a common theme in chess. You don't want to do this because of this, which wins the queen. That's actually quite interesting. So, okay, but it's certainly not worth trying for that trick. Certainly the best move is the move that Kosteniuk played, which is to take on d5, knight takes. Now white's castled. Now this is the change, because in the previous video we were looking at queen b3, which can and often does lead to a draw after knight a5. So white's alternative to avoid that kind of repetition is castling. It's slightly less forcing, but it's still a very good move, and we'll see Kosteniuk has a great game here. Black castles. Rook c1 is the most commonly played move by white. The idea is simply to put that rook on a half-open file. Sometimes there is an exchange and black wins the d4 pawn, which is currently isolated, but this can open the c file, and then the white rook takes on c7. Because say the queen has taken last on d4, then c7 is left undefended and the rook can take on c7. Actually, often that leaves white a bit better. So this is a good move. And then Tomashevsky plays knight b6. Now this is a natural and good move. Kosteniuk backs up the bishop to b3, just keeping it on that diagonal, looking at the vulnerable f7 pawn. This is actually an innovation by Tomashevsky, this knight at e7, but it's a very sensible and thematic idea. The idea is simply to plonk a knight on d5, supported by the c6 pawn. So while that's happening, Kosteniuk is moving her pieces into slightly more aggressive positions, knight e4, c6, and then the knight comes to c5. Now this is really interesting, and this is common in these lines. It's basically keeping an eye on the b7 pawn, which basically is stopping the bishop moving from c8, which also blocks the rook in. So it's sort of just trying to keep black bottled up. And also it's quite a hard knight to evict. Tomashevsky goes ahead and puts his king's knight on d5, which is a lovely square, and of course it's defended by the other knight, so if white takes, black can just take back with the knight or the pawn, or even the queen, but probably not the queen. Rook e1, a very natural move, just getting that rook onto an open file. I once was listening to a chess teacher who said you don't keep your Ferrari in the garage, you put your Ferrari on the open road. Rook b8, just defending that b7 pawn, so the bishop has an option to move. And then e5 is a very natural square for the knight, isn't it? Just eyeing that f7 pawn. So at the moment, there's not so much pressure because the knight's blocking on d5. But still, it's a nice square for the knight. And it's not that easy to evict because, for instance, if black plays moves like f6, that's creating real risks because it's opening the diagonal onto the king. Black develops the bishop. Now this is fascinating. At this point, after queen f3, white is already quite a lot better. So white gains a tempo by hitting the bishop, but white is already not quite yet winning, but a lot better. Bishop has to back up, and then queen g3 is a good move, just looks aggressive, doesn't it? Creating threats around the king. And again, the engine thinks white's a lot better. And now the engine thinks that white is basically winning. And that is fascinating because it's not really obvious how. But takes here is the correct move. Pawn takes back. And then Kosteniuk plays the engine move, which is rook e4, getting that rook into a kind of active position and developing a kingside attack. Black again occupies that wonderful d5 square, blocking out the bishop and putting that knight on a central square, very sensible. Rook h4, again the engine move, just looking at that, the kingside in general and h7 in particular. Black's knight comes back to the kingside, but now this is, according to the engines, completely gone, which, to be honest, it fascinates me because I wouldn't see that. Bishop c2, again looking at the h7 pawn. And then black brings the queen in to defend. So the queen comes to e7. This is connecting the rooks and also defending the g7 pawn. But the real problem, as we've discussed, is h7. So white moves the queen to h3, attacking the h7 pawn. Now, black's in real crisis, so it's hard really for the engines to offer good advice here. I mean, they're saying h6, but they're basically saying it's gone. So black plays g5, which allows the queen to defend the h7 pawn and is with tempo because the pawn's attacking the rook. The rook just keeps up the attack, moving to h6, and then there's a really pretty tactic at the end here. Queen comes across, but unfortunately now this allows the bishop to take, and although that bishop is only defended twice and it's attacked 3 times, if the king can't take. If the queen takes, the rook takes the queen, and if the knight takes, Alexandra Kosteniuk has rook g6, which pins the queen against the king. So at the moment the material deficit is not terrible, because white has sacked a man apiece, but unfortunately the white attack continues. So black tries to centralise a rook, but Kosteniuk plays queen h6, attacking the queen for a second time. I guess what has to happen now is that black takes with the queen. I mean, Tomashevsky resigned here, but let's just look at it. If the queen takes, then queen takes here, check, king in the corner, and then the knight check pretty much finishes it off because black has to give up the rook for the knight. So this was a really nice win. You know, just a simple kingside attack, and actually it was winning when it still looked to me like black was reasonably solid, white was actually winning. So I suppose my thought on this is that it really can creep up on you. And in this line, it can really creep up on black. And in this line, Kosteniuk didn't take many risks. You know, she didn't risk much. The only risk was to have that isolated D pawn, which can be a problem in the endgame. But apart from that, no real risk. So it was a very impressive, smooth game, really, and I think it was a good advertisement for the line. Next, we're going to look at a game between Kosteniuk and Leko, I think in the same tournament, I think in the Tal Memorial Blitz, where it goes wrong and Black finds a very effective defence. Peter Leko is a wonderful player. I really enjoy his commentary of the Meltwater Cup. I mean, he basically became, within a heartbeat of becoming world champion against Kramnik. So Peter Leko really, really knows his stuff and is a great defensive player. So in the next game, we'll look at how Black can defend against this line where White is castling on the 10th move. Hope you've enjoyed this and see you soon.